welcome back to While You Were Cleaning. Today I have a really fun video to share with you. We are going to be redoing some thrift store and garage sale and even free finds to look a little bit more like pottery pieces. I have some clear glass containers, I have some ceramic vases, I even have some wooden vases, and I wanted to try some different pottery DIY methods on these to see how they turn out, to see which method I like the best. I have done a thrift store DIY in the past that I used plaster of Paris on. We will be trying some plaster of Paris again today, but then we'll be adding in some other methods as well. So I hope that you enjoy today's video and that it's really helpful for you in order to get that little bit more high-end pottery look by using some of these cheaper finds that you can get at the thrift store or yard sales, wherever you might find them. So I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you do, please hit that like button, please comment and subscribe, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'll be trying out today's first method on this round glass container. I love the shape on this one, but the color doesn't really go with the color scheme in my home. And I'm going to try and give this a terracotta look. So these are some paints that I picked up from Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to mix them together to try and get that terracotta shade. You can, of course, buy paint that's already in a terracotta color, but I already had these paints on hand, so I wanted to mix them instead of buying something new. So I'm just adding a little bit as I go, trying to get the shade that I'm looking for. So for this first method, we'll be thickening our paint with some baking soda. And I accidentally dumped in a little bit too much, so I had to thin it out again with just a little bit more paint. But the baking soda really thickens up your paint, and it also gives it a little bit of a graininess. So when you paint it onto your glass container, it gives it that rougher texture for the finish. This is my first time trying out this method, so it was a little bit of trial and error. This first coat was a little bit thinner than what I was expecting it to be, so I did add some more baking soda to my paint to really thicken up the second coat, and this one went on so much better. As you can see, it's a lot thicker and it covers the color of this container a lot better, and I really like the finished look on this one. What I noticed about this baking soda mixture is when you first brush it on, you can see those brush strokes, and then it kind of self-levels itself and it really smooths out the finish. So you're not going to really have those brush strokes on the finish unless you come back and you brush it as your paint is drying and you keep brushing over it. It will smooth out, and you can see how the top part of the vase here is already kind of evening out on the finish, while the bottom, those brush strokes are really showing up. I also wanted to try out this baking soda mixture method on this white glass container, and I mixed a cream color of paint using these two colors from Dollar Tree and added my baking soda into there. I wanted you to see how the finish turns out on a container that already has some texture on it. So this white container has these ridges on there, and I wanted you to see how this baking soda would turn out on there. And I did use 2 coats on this, and it does kind of cover up the texture of this base. Here are those finished containers using the baking soda method. I really love the texture on these. I think they really do look like pottery pieces with how the baking soda mixture dried on them. One thing to note though is they do dry a good deal lighter than what your finished color is, just because of all that extra baking soda in there. So it's just something to remember as you're mixing paint. For our next method, we'll be painting this glass container very similar to how we did the first, except for this time we'll be mixing this black paint from Dollar Tree with some baking powder. Baking powder works pretty similar to baking soda, except when the baking powder is mixed with the paint, it kind of has a chemical reaction and it puffs up a little bit, so it covers really well. And I noticed at the end it does give a different finish texture, so you'll be able to see that after we get the second coat on. This first coat was a little bit thinner than what I was planning. So again, this is my first time trying this method. So when I did add my second coat on, I did add some more baking powder to my mix, and it covered a lot better for that second coat. I noticed that this baking powder seemed to keep those brush strokes more than the baking soda did. Where the baking soda looked like it was leveling out the surface and a little bit smoother of a surface, the baking powder, you can see here, you can see the brush strokes a little bit more. It does have a little bit of a grainier texture to it. And again, this did dry lighter than that black color. I didn't add any gray to this. This is the finished color. Our next method we are going to try out on this jug, and as you can see it says it'll do on this side. So I am going to be using some plaster of Paris on this, and I'm going to see if I can kind of fill in those words or cover them up a little bit more by using this plaster of Paris. I did mix the plaster of Paris a little bit thicker than what the instructions are. I believe the instructions are normally 2 parts plaster to 1 part water, and I did it more like 50-50 because I wanted it to be nice and thick to be able to keep those brush strokes and to cover in the words on the side. I have used plaster of Paris before on other containers, and I do have a video with that, so I will link that above for you so that you can go and see that video and the methods I used for those containers as well. But here you can see, having that plaster of Paris a little bit thicker, you really see those brush strokes from the brush that I'm using. Once the plaster of Paris was completely dry, I used a sanding block just to smooth down any little pieces that I maybe didn't want to be raised, or if it was a little bit thick in some areas, you can just sand it right off. Once my container was all sanded, I spray painted it to even out the color on the surface, and I used this rust-oleum satin stone gray color. You do want to use something that's satin or flat or ultra flat. You don't want the finished coat to be shiny. I used 2 coats of spray paint to finish off this container. I also wanted to mention that it is a good idea to use a coat of primer before adding your plaster. I completely forgot about that step, but I do talk about it in my other video if you want to go check out that one. And here is that finished container. I love the look of this one. It really does completely change the look of the container now that you have the brush strokes and the plaster finish. And here is another container that I used that plaster of Paris on, and I started out doing a shorter brushstroke look. I just wanted to show you how you can do any type of design on the finish of your container by adding this plaster. So I started out with that shorter brushstroke, and then I just started adding on the plaster a little bit thicker and doing larger brush strokes. And you can see how it looks here. It really adds just so much texture to a container that had no texture to it at all. So it's one of the easiest methods to really add a completely different look to your containers. Again, I took a sanding block to this container just to smooth down the edges, and you can sand as little or as much as you want. You just want to make sure you don't have any little pieces sticking up because they can be kind of sharp. So just make sure you sand down any of those sharper edges. Next, I kind of wanted to give this container a terracotta color, and I thought that this rust-oleum cinnamon color would do that, but it just turned out bright orange, and I was not a fan of how this looked because I just went from bright green to bright orange. So instead, I just added 2 coats of black spray paint onto this, and here you can see how the finish turned out on this container using, again, the plaster of Paris. And like I said before, I will link that other video where I use this method in a little bit different way. Next, I want to show you the difference that just adding spray paint can make. So this is some sort of grass or wood woven container, and it already has some texture to it, so I'm going to spray paint it with this Rust-Oleum flat black spray paint. Spray painting is perfect for containers that already have some texture to them because it will get into all of those ridges and areas that are kind of hard to get when you're just hand painting. So I did add 2 coats of spray paint to this container, and here you can see how it really brings out the texture on the container by spray painting it all one color. And then I always just suggest, if you're trying to make something look a little bit more like pottery, just use something that is more of a flat spray paint because it will give it a better finished look. I'm also going to be spray painting this small brown container, and I'll be using that same Rust-Oleum flat black color, and then I'll be adding a little bit something different to this container so it's not just painted. So first I did add 2 coats of spray paint to the container, and then here you can see how the finish is on that with the flat black color. And with this container, I am going to be dipping the bottom in some plaster of Paris. So I mixed the plaster of Paris according to the directions this time because you do want it to be a little bit more runny, and you just need enough so that you can stick your container in the bottom and twist it. I did try to twist it in a couple different layers to layer it on the bottom, and I went one too many times and messed up the texture a little bit. So just don't overdo it. You can do it 2 or 3 times. Just don't go that one last time or it might mess up the texture. But the great thing about plaster of Paris is if you do mess up, you can take a sanding block to it and you can smooth out that outside edge a little bit. So that's what I did here, just to smooth out the finished look on it. And then you can see here how it looks all finished. It does have a nice dipped look to it. I love the contrast between the black and the plaster. Here's another larger container that I found at the thrift store, and I'm going to be trying yet another method on this one. So we're going to start off by spray painting it with this Rust-Oleum Ultra Matte spray paint in the color white. I did need to add 2 to 3 coats of spray paint to this container just because I was going from such a dark color to white, so it did take several coats to cover it up. These ultra matte spray paints from Rust-Oleum are some of my favorites, and they come in several different colors. I normally just use the white and the black. And here's what that looks like painted out in the white. As you can see, it's a nice matte finish. Now we're going to antique this a little bit with some mud. Thankfully, it was raining this day, so it was really easy to pick up some dirt. I just added a little bit of water to it, and then I'm just going to rub this over the entire surface of this white container. This is a great project to give to your kids if you don't like to get your hands dirty, as long as they're careful enough not to break your container. And then after that mud completely dries, you can go back over it and rub it off as little or as much as you want. I started off by using a paper towel, and it just wasn't strong enough to really get off as much as I wanted to take off. So then I used this sponge and I used the rough side to take off the mud and then use the smoother side to dust it off. And here's how that finished container turned out with this method. You could also achieve this using some brown paint if you wanted to water it down and wipe it over the surface. Just don't let it completely dry. You'll want to wipe it back off a little bit sooner than it's dry. And then here's how it looks on another color of container as well. I did it on this gray one. It also looks great on black containers. Alright, so those are all of the methods that I have to share with you today. I hope that this video has been very helpful for you. Let me know down in the comments which of these methods you are excited to try. Thank you all so much for watching today's video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!